Hey there, welcome to another chat on the concept of self and personality. So far in the course of the chapter, we've unraveled the self. I hope that it helped you guys to raise some self awareness. Well, I'm sure that you know yourself a little more than before, and hoping so. If that's true, feel free and be happy to share it with me. As we move ahead, we unraveled the entire concept of personality. It was not just the definition and the characteristic features of personality, but we also discovered how there are two approaches to understand the concept of personality. These are the type and the trait approaches. Of the two types, trait and type, which was your favorite? Do feel free to share that with me as well. Up ahead, as we discovered the chapter, we understood the several schools of thought and what they had to talk about the concept and notion of personality. We discovered the psychoanalysis school of thought, which talked about Sigmund Freud. Freud, being the general physician he was, unraveled that a lot of the problems that people experience were deep rooted in their emotions and their interpersonal relationships. And finding a resolution to that was helping them overcome their physical complaints. He discovered several tools to help us understand the concept of personality, which was to do with dream analysis, which is to do with analysis of error, and free association, which helped us to further understand how personalities are shaped and to unravel our unconscious mind. We also understood the structure of personality according to Sigmund Freud, and we also came across certain criticisms for the structure that he shared with the world. Moving on, we also discussed the cultural, behavioral, and the humanistic schools of thought. If you do remember from our last conversation, we spoke about Carl Rogers and his contributions to understanding the congruency that one feels when the ideal self is close to the real self. Well, the congruency is what is at the heart of every human, and the harmony that we feel within is actually the calm, peace, and tranquility that we're all looking forward for. So, having summarized a little bit of what we've discussed so far, it's time to move ahead in the chapter. And for that purpose, we're going to explore the concept of assessment and personality. So, guys, I'm sure you're familiar with the word assessment. In the course of your school life, you've had several assessments. So, what are these assessments used for? Are they used for some form of measurement? That's right. That's exactly what personality assessment is all about. It is about some kind of a measurement for your own. It is a kind of measurement that is done to assess your personality type. This measurement sometimes is more structured, sometimes it is not so structured. And to understand this further ahead, let's deep dive into understanding the types of assessment and measurement of personality. Let's go. Now, to really understand the process of assessment, we must first try to define what assessment really means. Assessment is basically the procedures which are used to evaluate or differentiate people on the basis of certain characteristics. So, you know that all of us have various characteristics, and it's only based on these characteristics that we can define one individual from the other. Remember the concept of individual differences? That is how we differentiate people based out of their uniqueness. So the definition of personality assessment, it states that personality assessment is a very formal effort, guys, which is aimed to understand the personality of an individual. So it is specific, it is formal, it is targeted right at the individual so that we can understand this individual better. Now, there are several ways to assess the personality of the individual, but there are some commonly used techniques for this. So, the first type of technique which we will unravel together is called the direct measure. This measure is basically in the form of a self report. It's more like a assessment set of sheets which will ask you questions about yourself, and you will be required to report yourself by answering those questions. As you answer these questions, they reveal a lot of important information about yourself, and that's what we're going to explore now. So the first type is called self-report measures, which is also known as direct measures. Interestingly, this was given by a person called Alport. Alport interestingly suggested that the best way to assess an individual is simply by asking himself or herself about himself or herself. That is exactly what led to understandings of the self-report measures. What's really good to know about these measures, guys, is that these are very structured. By that, we mean that it is often based on theory, and it requires the subject to give these verbal responses on some kind of a rating scale. So there is a rating scale present based out of which verbal responses to the questions are answered. And the uniqueness of this is that the subject very objectively reports his or her own feelings with respect to those various items. Item means questions. So as you report yourself, the responses are so unique that they have the tendency to reveal a very unique aspect about you at the face value. Yes, of course, once when the questionnaire is complete, all of those responses are very quantitatively measured. They are interpreted on the basis of some norms which are successfully developed for this test. Once when the norms are used, a score is attained, which is then interpreted to reveal the true meaning of your personality. Isn't that so exciting to know? Now, if you're wondering whether if some of these tests they exist for you to take, yes they do. I request you to meet with your teacher at school and request her for a personality test. Some of these tests are the MMPI or the 16 personality factor, which are very easily available with all school teachers. Go ahead and check out your personality today. Now let's quickly together look at the three self-report measures as given by your NCERT textbook. Let's start with the first one, which is the MMPI. The MMPI has certain characteristics which we will do together, and as you can view, I have already highlighted the important keywords for you to underline or take score of. The MMPI, which is also called as a Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, is something that was developed by Hathaway and McKinley. These are the two authors of the test who developed a test which has 567 statements or questions, each of which has a true or a false response for the individual. So the test is divided into 10 subscales. Isn't that so interesting to know? And each of these subscales, they are measuring things like hypochondriasis, depression, hysteria, psychopathic deviate, masculinity, femininity, paranoia, psychasthenia, schizophrenia, mania, and social introversion. In India, it is so interesting to know that Malik and Joshi, they were the individuals who developed the Jodhpur multiphasic personality inventory for the Indian population to be culture fair along the lines of the Minnesota multiphasic personality inventory. This is a culture fair test. This is a culture based test, guys, and it'd be great if you could get your hands on it to then unravel more about your personality. The next questionnaire, which is a direct measure, which also is a self-report measure to your understanding of personality, is the EPQ, which is called as the Eysenck's Personality Questionnaire. This was developed by Eysenck. The test, it basically it measures you on two domains of personality, which is introverted, extroverted, and emotionally stable and emotionally unstable. So these dimensions are characterized by 32 personality traits as opposing tendencies. And of course, later on, Eysenck also added a third dimension, which is called as psychoticism. So, we all know what is to be introverted, which is wherein you feel timid and you are withdrawn and you love to spend time with your own self. You really do think and you like your own space to thrive. On the contrary, extroverted individuals are those individuals who are socially outgoing. They enjoy the luxury and presence of others and they thrive on it to recharge themselves. Up next on Eysenck scale is emotionally stable versus emotionally unstable, which is neuroticism versus emotional stability. Neuroticism is that state wherein an individual usually feels moody, irritable, they may feel restless, and a little hyper. On the contrary, so the individuals with neuroticism, they are unable to regulate their emotions and they feel like their emotions are all over the place. On the contrary, you have emotionally stable individuals who are more in charge of their emotions and they're able to calibrate and pivot them as deemed necessary by their environment. Now, these dimensions were the ones which were characterized by the 32 personality traits. However, when the third dimension was added by Eysenck, it was known as psychoticism. Psychoticism is that ability of the individual to be a little socially undesirable. These individuals are often the one who are hostile, aggressive, and they have the tendency to be, um, you know, and they have the tendency to be out of sorts at most time. Up next, we've got the 16 personality factor questionnaire. This questionnaire was developed by Cattell. Cattell, he provided this test which incorporated some declarative statements. These statements were questions which the subject, when they respond to a specific situation. So there were situation-based questions which were given, and it also comprised of a set of alternatives. So this test was used for high school students as well as for adults, and it was basically to measure the level that they were at. And it was found out to be extremely useful in career guidance, vocational explorations, and occupational testings as well. So 16PF guys is a rather interesting questionnaire. This is the one that has opposing tendencies to personality traits and it gives excellent insights into your personality type. Do try to get your hands on this, requesting your teacher at school, and it's going to give you some very interesting insights into your own personality. We'll now move ahead to some of the problems with these self-report measures. So you see that these measures, they have the idea of, oh my God. So some of these measures, they have the notion of self-desire. So some of these of the self-report measures, they have the notion of social desirability. You would want to you would prefer to be viewed in the eyes of the society as someone who's very desirable. So you would want to respond to it in a very socially desirable manner rather than projecting your true self onto that measure that's reporting yourself. So, social desirability is one of the biggest problems of a self report measure. The other one being acquiescence. So, acquiescence is that ability of yours to agree with or disagree with the items irrespective of their contents. So many times when you have to fill out a questionnaire and you just want to do it for the sake of doing it, and then without really reading, you respond to it with either a yes or a no. That's exactly what acquiescence is all about. It often appears in the form of saying yes to all the items without quite reading it. Up next, we're going to try to make an attempt to understand the second type of personality measurement. So the first type was very direct. It was basically about reporting yourself on a self-report measure. However, the second type, it's not very direct. It's all about the indirect measure. This indirect measure, it makes an attempt to measure your unconscious mind. Imagine something like that actually exists. I'm sure you've wondered so far about how is it that the conscious mind really We're going to start this again. So the first measure was very direct in its approach. It was all about reporting the self through some questions and statements which talked about the feelings and emotions that you felt, which were basically a very unique aspect of you while you answered directly. However, the second part to the measurement of personality assessment is not that direct. It's actually understood as an indirect measure, and as indirect measure it tends to identify things from your unconscious mind. Cut. Retake, please. The second part to personality assessment actually measures your unconscious. Yes, can you believe it? There are measures to measure your unconscious as well. And this is done through the idea of projective techniques. Projective techniques are an indirect measure to the assessment of your personality. And this is done very interestingly through certain techniques which we will just discuss. So, projective techniques are basically techniques which are developed to assess your unconscious motives and feelings. These techniques are based on the assumption that something which is less structured or unstructured will allow you to really talk about that specific aspect with your true feelings and desires about that situation. So the more you remove the individual from the whole perspective, they're able to more honestly give their opinions about that specific situation and belief. This is what projection is all about. And that's how this technique works. So, there are some features to projective techniques. These features are: number one, the stimulus which is shown to the subject, it is relatively or fully unstructured and poorly defined. So basically, a very unstructured stimulus is shown to the subject and they're asked to tell us whatever it is that they see. Right? So it is very poorly defined so that the individual could get up and talk about it the way they really think and feel. Up next, the person being assessed is usually never told about the purpose of assessment, okay, and also about the scoring and interpretation. So this is hidden from the subject. Next, the person is informed that there are no correct or incorrect responses. So whatever they talk about will be a true projection of their own self, and therefore there is nothing wrong or right about whatever they share with us. Second last, that each response that they give out is actually considered to reveal a very significant aspect of their own personality. So it could be anything and none of it would be judged, but instead it would reveal something which is very specific to them. And last off, the scoring and interpretation of all of this is rather lengthy and sometimes it's also subjective and would depend upon the expertise of the individual who's interpreting it. With these as the features and the definition of projective technique, this could show up as a 3 or a 4 marker in your boards. So please make sure to underline all the keywords you see on your screen while I teach. There are some methods to the projective techniques, which is what we will discuss and explore together now. So the first test is called Herman Rorschach's Inkblot test. So how this really goes is that we take a blank sheet, a A4 size blank sheet, and we take 2 different inks. So you could also take 2 different colored paints. Gather some paint on your brush and splatter it in the middle of the sheet one by one. So you will have 2 splashes, 2 different colors of splashes on the center of a A4 size sheet. Then simply take the sheet and fold it into half. Once when you fold the sheet, make sure to stamp it well and slowly open the sheet. What you will find on the sheet will be an image that looks just like this. Can you guys see the image right here? This is what your ink blot might look like. Once when the ink blot is ready, you may ask your subject, what is it that they see in this sheet? Do you all agree? Now, if we look at the features of projective techniques, do you agree that this is significantly unstructured? That means this has no structure. Some of us might Some of us might see angels over here, some of us might see a bat, some of us might actually identify a dragon or a demon soaring in the sky. So, based out of how we're feeling, very truly, we could give out a response, and this response would be very non threatening because it would just talk about what is it that you would see. It won't really talk about what is it that something that would raise anxiety or fear inside of you while you responded. So anything that allows you to very freely talk about how and what you see will help you not only to give a true response but also help to gather a true understanding significantly about one's personality. If you look back at Herman Rorschach's test, how this is actually administered is via 10 ink blots. So there are these 10 ink blots, 5 of them are black and white in color and 2 of them are in red ink. There are also some other blots which are in pastel colors which are administered to the individual. So these blots are basically symmetrical in design and shape and form, and each of them is actually printed on a white cardboard. Okay, so all of the blots were originally made by dropping a piece of ink, a little bit of ink on a piece of paper like I shared earlier. Once these blots are ready, they are administered in 2 phases. These phases are called as performance proper and inquiry. In the first phase, the subjects are actually shown the cards one by one and they're asked to tell what is it that they see in them. In the second phase, which is called the inquiry phase, a very detailed report is given to the subject to ask them why did they say what they said in terms of the symbols that they see, and symbolically what they said, to inquire. Once when the subject provides with responses for the same, a true understanding of the personality of the individual is frameworked upon. Of course, guys, the interpretation of the test, it requires extensive training because every response made has a true meaning which is very deep and very unique to the individual for the same. There are also some computer techniques which have been done for analysis of the data of such a test. Isn't this so interesting? I urge you guys to create your own Inkblot today and also try administer it to some of your friends or relatives to understand and see how they respond. Feel free to share the symbols which your subjects come up with, and I'd be happy to share an interpretation with you for the same. With this, let's dive into the next projective technique, which is another indirect method to assess and measure your personality. This is called as the thematic apperception test, and this was developed by Morgan and Murray. So this is a little more than the structured Inkblot test. What it looks like is that this test consists of 30 black and white picture cards. So they're just pictures of a certain situation and they're black and white in color. There's also one blank card. Now, every picture, it depicts a couple of people in the card as well as a situation in which they are in. Okay, so this card is simply shown to the individual one by one, as it's a set of 20 cards, and also it's been noticed that the administration of 5 to 10 cards is also appropriate and successful in revealing a significant aspect of one's personality. So these cards are presented one at a time, and the subject is asked to tell a story describing the situation which is presented in this picture. A very standard procedure is used for the scoring of thematic apperception test responses. Okay, it's quite interesting that when you project this image to the client, they are able to describe the situation depending upon what they feel is happening in it. However, not knowing that when they project their own understanding of the picture onto the card, they actually are speaking from their own unconscious mind. This is what a thematic apperception test looks like. If you can take a moment to look at these images, I'm curious to know what you see in these. And based out of what you feel is happening in the image, as you describe it for me, as an individual who has been certified in the test, I'd be able to share with you what your responses for the same truly mean, thereof describing to you a significant aspect of your own personality. Okay, feel free to administer these cards, which are also available online, onto your friends and peers. And again, I'd be happy to reveal the meanings of the same with you. Feel free to pin them in the comment section for me to connect with you. Great. Now we will move on to the next projective technique, which is an indirect measure to understanding your personality. Let's move up ahead to the next interesting approach to assessment of your personality, which is another cut. Let's move up ahead to another interesting method, which is indirect method to assess your personality. This is called as a Rosenwig picture frustration study. So this specific study, it's basically, you know how you see those cartoon strips in a newspaper and you see like a series of events happening in the strip. So Rosenwig basically developed this strip of a lot of different things which are happening in the form of images, and usually they create a scenario where the individual feels frustrated. Once this individual is frustrated, it is measured how the individual responds or behaves towards that condition. So the test is basically in the form of some cartoon like pictures. They provide a series of situations in which one person is frustrating another one or calls attention to a frustrating condition, and the subject is then asked to tell what is it that this individual who has gotten frustrated, how is it cut? We start with another. We are now going to look at the third interesting indirect measure to assess your personality, and this is called the Rosenwig's picture frustration study. In this study, it was developed by Rosenwig. What it does is it basically measures how is it that people express their aggression, or they try to create a frustrating situation. Now, how they do it, have you looked at those cartoon strips in a newspaper? And usually the strips make you feel a certain way. Well, in this test, there are cartoon-like pictures as well, which basically create a series of situations in the cartoon strip as itself. And here and these images, basically the person is shown to be frustrated with another person, or this person in the strip is shown to be calling attention to a frustrating condition. So the subject who is looking at the strip is basically asked to tell that how is it that this frustrated person would then respond or behave, or what is it that they would say and do. The analysis of responses is based on the type of direction of aggression. Okay, so this is what helps us to identify that how is it that the person would then respond under a frustrating circumstance. This individual called Parikh, he's the one who has adapted this test for use within the Indian population as well. Okay, to make it culture fair for the Indian population, Parikh helped convert it, which is suitable for the Indians now. Up next, we've got the sentence completion test. In this test, there are a lot of incomplete sentences which are provided to the individual, as you can see in your books. And these sentences are given out to the subject, and the subject is simply asked to complete the sentence in a word or two. The ending is always often not provided. So in this type of test, the endings are usually written by the subject, and that's what reveals a very true aspect of the individual's attitudes, motivations, conflicts, feelings towards the first half of the sentence. That first half of the sentence could be an item, could be a person, could be a circumstance or a situation. So how this really helps is that it basically gives a lot of opportunities to the subject to reveal their underlying unconscious motive towards the symbols or the subject matter of the sentence. And this is the sentence completion test. The next test that we'll do here is called draw a person test. This is my favorite, guys. How a draw a person test really works is that a subject is given a paper and pencil and is usually asked to draw a person. So once when the person draws the person, they're usually asked to draw the opposite sex person, because usually when given to a female, the female will always draw a female and a male will tend to draw a male. So after the drawing is complete, the subject is asked to draw the figure of the opposite sex person. Once when the figure is ready, the subject is asked to make a story about this person. They're asked to identify that what is it that this person is all about, what is the character of the person, what is the novel or a play, or whatever it is that comes to the individual's mind. They're asked to basically, make up a story. Once when that is done, there are some interpretations which are quite interesting to know. And I suggest that before you look at the interpretations, you actually pull out a paper and pen and draw this person. Okay, so the first interpretation is omission of facial features. So if your client or subject has drawn a person and their facial features are missing, this suggests that the person is trying to evade a highly conflict-ridden interpersonal relationship. Okay, so there is some huge conflict that's going about in the individual's personal relationship. Up next, graphic emphasis on the neck. If the neck is something that is too long or too short, it usually suggests lack of control over their impulses. Okay, so there needs to be a good impulse check on the individual as to whatever it is that's going on with them. Last off, if the head of the person that they've drawn is largely bigger than the rest of the body, then this disproportionately large head suggests that there is some organic brain disease and preoccupation with headaches that the individual is experiencing at a moment in time. So, do you see, guys, how these tests are rather sneaky and very indirect in their ways to help us understand and give us an insight into the true aspect of our personality? How unconsciously they get their way in to our unconscious selves, how consciously they get to our unconscious selves and help us give a significant aspect of our own personality. So some of these tests are rather interesting, and I would urge you to check them out and conduct them on yourselves or a loved one and come back with responses for me to help you unravel the symbols. Up next, we're going to move ahead to the behavioral approach to understandings of personality. Okay, last off, we're going to look at behavioral analysis, which is another method of personality assessment. This is basically a method which is used to assess the individual's behavior in a variety of situations to see and collect information about his or her personality. So the observation method is based upon certain techniques which the observations of which the learning school of thought actually focuses upon, and some of these are interview. So when we talk about interview as a method to assess anybody's personality, it is a diagnostic and a statistical kind of a measurement which involves a lot of in-depth understanding of the individual. So sometimes this is structured, at other times this is unstructured. And whether if it's either of the two will depend upon the purpose or the goals of assessment itself. So structured interviews are those interviews which are common across all individuals who are to be interviewed. Unstructured can take their own discourse and they can ask questions based out of whatever it is that the tester is trying to draw information about. But yes, of course, both of them tend to be quite in-depth. Another method which is used for the behavioral assessment of personality is observation. As a tool, observation for personality assessment is a very sophisticated procedure and it can be carried out by an untrained person. It cannot be carried out by an untrained person. It requires very careful training and it obviously comes with some fairly detailed guidelines. So, all of the analysis of behavior that needs to be done, it comes with certain guidelines which must be adhered to kind of measure the person correctly. We're going to start with the observation method. The observation method is actually a great tool for the measurement of personality. It is quite a sophisticated procedure which needs to be carried out by a trained professional. Untrained people will simply not be able to make observations in the correct manner, and careful training for the same needs to be provided to the individual. So, some very fairly detailed guidelines are given out to the individual who is going to analyze the behavior of such persons in order to get a true measurement of one's personality. Of course, there are some limitations to the observation method. The first one being that it requires professional training, without which the usefulness of data drawn might not be appropriate. Also, it is quite time consuming and demanding. Two, the maturity of a psychologist is an absolute precondition because the data that you receive will be subject to a lot of analysis and interpretation, doing of which will require you to be thorough in the use of this technique. Last off, the mere presence of an observer can actually contaminate information and results, right? Because as a stranger, the observer effect might be present, and the influence of this on the individual being observed might not be able to help you get or fetch raw data. So these are some of the limitations of the observation method. Another rather interesting technique which is used is understood as behavioral ratings. Behavioral ratings, they're generally taken from people who know the assessee very intimately. These ratings, they are drawn upon the interactions which the individual has had with the person over a period of time, and they give them the chance to be observed. So this attempt, they actually put individuals into certain categories in terms of their behavioral qualities. So let's say that I work with a team of individuals and I get the chance to observe them carefully. This gives me an opportunity and a platform to actually assess them on various areas of their functioning appropriately and allows me to give them a rating out of 5 based on the various aspects that I'm attempting to assess them upon. This is how behavioral ratings are successfully used, guys. Now, obviously, these will come with certain limitations. If I'm a rater, I might often display certain bias that might color my judgment of these individuals. For example, most of us, we greatly get influenced by a single favorable or a single unfavorable trait. This often forms the biases in the rater's overall judgment of the person. This tendency, friends, is known as the halo effect. When one good thing or one bad thing done by the individual influences their overall impressions is what is understood as the halo effect. Of course, raters also have the tendency to place the individuals in the middle of the scale. When I don't want to put so much effort into understanding whether if they're good or bad, I just tend to keep them neutral, and that middle of the scale is called the middle category bias. However, I sometimes do I might avoid trying extreme positions. But when I sometimes allot an extreme position to the individual, depending upon their goodness or badness, that is all understood as the extreme response bias, which I might assign to friends or foes. The second last interesting technique that we'll look together is understood as nomination. Nomination is a phenomenon wherein one or more individuals are asked from within the group to be nominated to work or study or play or participate in an activity. This person will be asked to specify the reason for his. I'm going to do nomination again. The second last interesting technique which we will do to measure your personality is understood as nomination. Using nomination is an interesting phenomenon wherein you would be asked to work with one or more persons on a group project or a study or to participate in a group activity. Once when you choose the person, you will be asked to specify why is it that you spoke and chose about the specific person to work with you. So the nominations which are then received, they will be analyzed to understand the personality and behavioral qualities of the person. This is how personality gets assessed in the process of nomination. Last and most interesting technique that we'll do is called a situational test. A situational test, guys, is basically a test which is devised for assessment to understand the personality of the individual. The most commonly used situation test is called the situational stress test. This allows us to gain information about the person, about how is it that they behave in stressful situations. Obviously, the test requires a person to perform a given task with other persons who are instructed to be non-cooperative and interfering. So when an individual is non-cooperative and interfering with you, it obviously is some form of a role play. But what's important to be observed and noted is how is it that you respond to the individual in this test. So a verbal report of the same is obtained on what he or she was asked to do. The situation may be a realistic situation or it may be something that is created on through a video play or a movie scene. However, it collects a response and it gives a true indication of one's personality. This was all about the measurement of personality. This was all about the measurement of personality through direct and indirect techniques. Also, through the observational method of analysis of personality. I hope that you guys have thoroughly enjoyed exploring assessments with me today. This was rather in-depth, however interesting. Please do get back to me with responses if you've gathered any from your friends or relatives while conducting some of these tests on them. I would look forward to them. And with this, guys, we come to a wrap to the chapter of self and personality. I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I have enjoyed delivering it to you. See you in the next chapter. Meanwhile, there are some essential questions which I will post for you to explore in the comments below. See you around. Bye.